We're very happy this evening to have you join us for this session, Beyond a Seat at the Table, Approaches to Supporting Black Survivors of Homicide Victims by our esteemed Professor Tanya Sharpe. My name is Andrea. I'm president of the Alumni Association, and we're very happy that you've joined us this evening. And it's lovely if people wish to show their faces. I'm sure Tanya will appreciate that. So I'd like to start off by doing a land acknowledgement. We are very fortunate to be here and we don't take it for granted. And so we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge the city of Toronto as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We have a responsibility to be active players in decolonization, of which we're currently enacting by learning, staying informed about the needs and desires of our Indigenous comrades. Today is February 28th, and I wish to acknowledge the people like myself who were brought across the Atlantic without being given a choice, people who were brought on the transatlantic human trade ship. I wish to acknowledge other nations who came to this land by choice through colonialism, of which some forgot that they were settlers. We give thanks to the Indigenous ancestors for their patience, we give thanks to the Indigenous ancestors for their patience, but we acknowledge that it has been exploited. Can we now take 10 seconds and reflect on where we are currently situated as we're currently in a Zoom session? Thank you. I actually wondered if people could take the time. I'd like to ask everyone to take the time and research, if you have not as of yet, which land, whose land you are on, where you are currently located. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Tanya Sharpe joined the Factor-Inwentash Faculty in July 2018 after serving as an associate professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work for 11 years. She received her Ph.D. in social work from Boston College, located in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Sharpe is a community-engaged researcher who examines sociocultural factors that influence the coping strategies of Black family members and friends of homicide victims for the purpose of developing culturally responsive approaches and sustainable opportunities, allowing Black communities to survive the aftermath of homicide. Dr. Sharpe is the founder and director of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, the CRIB, a multidisciplinary initiative designed to advance research, policy, and practice, and with Black survivors of homicide victims throughout our global community. In addition to several research projects, the CRIB also hosts a popular Instagram live series entitled 30 at 8:30, where Dr. Sharpe, alongside community and academic guests, experts explore how structural violence and homicide in its many forms has traumatically impacted some of our most vulnerable populations. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Sharpe at this time.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that warm welcome and the invitation rounding out the end of the month of February. And thank you so much, distinguished alumni, for having me this evening. So I am going to share with you this presentation entitled Beyond a Seat at the Table. And then hopefully afterwards, we'll have a very rich discussion wherein I will be happy to respond to any questions you might have. So again, good evening, everyone. My name is Tanya Sharpe, and I'm an associate professor at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. And for the past 20 years, I've been developing a program of research for and in collaboration with Black surviving family members and friends of homicide victims. A topic that has real-world implications to spaces and places throughout the globe. Chicago, Illinois, Johannesburg, South Africa, Kingston, Jamaica, Baltimore, Maryland, and right here in Toronto, Canada. In short, no one is immune. But I'll circle back to that in a moment. Before I begin, I think it's important that you understand what drew me to this work, my calling, if you will. Before entering grad school, I was working at the Harvard School of Public Health Practice, Division of Public Health Practice, working side by side with families and friends who were surviving the homicide of a loved one. I was working with them for the purpose of developing violence prevention programs. And it was during that time that I met Edna. And Edna, well, Edna's son had just been murdered. A bunch of us who worked with Edna attended the funeral to pay our respects. I remember entering the church, and as I approached Edna, I extended my hand and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Edna looked at me with disdain and said, "I didn't lose my son. He was taken from me." Her words struck me. They struck me to my very core. And it was in that moment, that exact moment, I knew I was called to do this work. In that moment, two things became very clear. If I, as a trained social worker, even with the best of intentions, did not know how to comfort her or support her, how equipped would other service providers be? The other thing I thought about was, how would Edna cope with the murder of her son? Now, Edna's story is not unlike the surviving mom whose son had just been murdered 1 month prior to my meeting her after delivering the keynote address at the inaugural Survivors of Homicide Victims Conference here in Toronto. And all I could do was hold the space for her pain. A few years back, on a trip to Boston, I saw Edna again, and I ran over to her with excitement. I wanted to tell her that I kept my promise, that through my work, I'm uplifting the voices of so many who feel voiceless. That familiar weight of sadness clouded her eyes. And she grabbed my hand and said, "Tanya, I'm so glad, because my son Leonard, Edna's youngest son, was murdered last year. Time is running out," she said, "and we need you." So I'm very clear that the work that I do is in service to them, the survivors whose wounds are not visible to the naked eye, but in the absence of culturally responsive interventions are often left to fester and never heal. Now, I want to provide some context relevant to homicide throughout our global community. On average, each year, 17,000 murders occur in the US. And what you'll hear many people say is that compared to other forms of violent crime, that number's fairly low. However, when you think about who the majority of homicide victims are, young Black men and women living in urban areas. When you realize that although African Americans make up only 13% of the US population, and yet they account for more than half of homicide victims. And when you understand that on average, African Americans experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2 times in their lifetime, you begin to realize that we are dealing with an epidemic that disproportionately impacts some of our most vulnerable. Now, this overrepresentation of Black homicide victims is not unique to the United States. On average, 600 murders occur in Canada each year. And out of the 13 provinces and territories, the numbers of homicides is often highest in Ontario. In 2019, StatsCan released data indicating that racialized populations accounted for 75% of homicide victims in Ontario, 44% of whom identified as African, Caribbean, or Black. In Jamaica, on average, Jamaicans experience 1,500 murders each year, 9 times the global rate. In South Africa, South Africans experience 18,000 murders each year, 7 times the global rate. Now, Redmond and Doka suggest that on average, each homicide victim has at least 7 to 10 family members and friends who must now learn how to cope with the tragic murder of their loved ones. But the numbers alone don't allow for us to see that for Black people, our relationship to one another extends far beyond blood ties and country borders. So the ripple effect and impact of homicide is far reaching, suggesting that the number of family members and friends is far greater than research predicts. In addition, when we consider the frequency in which homicide occurs in Black communities throughout the global diaspora, the United States, Canada, the Caribbean, Africa, Brazil, you begin to understand that we are dealing with a disproportionate number of Black people who are struggling to make sense out of that which is senseless. The numbers alone, devoid of both social and cultural context, contribute to gaps in research, policy, and practice, often allowing for false narratives to be made about the causes and consequences of experiencing the homicide of a loved one for Black communities, resulting in mistrust in formal institutions such as universities, the police, mental and medical health care services, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want us to take a moment. Let's take a moment to really understand the disproportionate reality of homicide for Black people. Specifically, I want you to think about who Black survivors of homicide victims are. They are your clients, your peers, your students, your child's coach, your mechanic, our military, our colleagues, the pilot that offered a soft landing home from your last vacation, your grocery store clerk, your family, your children's friends. They might even be you. So it is with this understanding of who they are and how we are all impacted, we are better positioned to not only understand the prevalence of cumulative Black death, we begin to comprehend the traumatic pandemic of grief that disproportionately devastates Black communities. It's with this understanding we are better positioned and informed about ways we might support and intervene. Now, you may be thinking, as tragic as homicide is, I can't relate to the Black experience. Or perhaps you're thinking that the subject matter is not related to your area of research or practice. I want us to take a moment to think about that. Really, really think about it. When we consider the plethora of systems and services that survivors of homicide victims engage with on a daily basis, as well as the ones they need and interact with as a result of experiencing the murder of a loved one. Social work, medical and mental public health care systems, education, law, justice, criminology and socio-legal services, public policy, technology, engineering, data science, faith-based institutions, global affairs, sociology. You begin to understand that you as teachers, researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and alumni, you play a pivotal role in what should and could be a global response to this unacknowledged and under-researched pandemic of grief. What we must also keep in mind is that Black people are not only grieving the pervasive murder of family members and friends on a global scale, but they are also experiencing collective trauma as a result of seeing the constant brutal erasure of us over social media streams, played over and over and over again. This chronic exposure to cumulative Black death, wherein even if you are not related to the victim, you see yourself, your sons, your daughters, your brothers, your sisters. You see them all in these images. This collective trauma contributes to the grief of our humanity, our safety at pandemic proportions. And it does something to you. It shatters one's soul. These individual and collective experiences of homicide impact the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of Black survivors of homicide victims, leading to a ubiquity of injustice that complicates and disenfranchises their ability to grieve. If by chance, a murder is captured on video, we wait. We wait. And we wait with bated breath for the perpetrators to be brought to trial and convicted, holding out for some shred of acknowledgement and recognition that we have the right to jog while Black, drive while Black, order coffee while Black, talk on a cell phone while Black, enter your dorm room while Black, bird watch while Black, eat ice cream in your own home while Black, breathe while Black. We experience the ubiquity of injustice, not only in the collective viewing of our demise, or during trials where anti-Black racism is often the 13th juror, but also the manner in which reporting the prevalence of Black homicide is not acknowledged due to the lack of race-based data collection, as is the case in Canada, or when race-based data on homicide is available, as is in the US. Absent from the discussion is the overrepresentation of Black homicides, particularly as it pertains to Black women, Black trans women, young, etc. We've seen this over and over again in, most recently, the reporting of the increase in homicides, both in Canada and the US, where there is a specific absence of the chronic acknowledgement of the fact that the increase has been quite prevalent for Black communities throughout the diaspora. When we think about the systematic way Anti-Black racism permeates the very fabric of our society, infecting like a relentless virus of violent inequity, those structures that Black people rely upon for their survival. We have a responsibility to take action. Now, after meeting Edna those many years ago, I thought about how I might take action, how I could make a difference for thousands of individuals and communities struggling to survive the unthinkable. In the early stages of my career, in the absence of research, scholarship, and mental health services designed to respond to the unmet needs of Black survivors of homicide victims, I set my sights. I set my sights on ensuring that we, as Black people, had a seat at the table. Roxane Gay stated that having a seat at the table meant that Black people were a part of the conversation, informing research, policy, and practice with the goal of helping Black communities to thrive. And so I started there. I began to look through the limited amount of research that was published relevant to survivors of homicide victims, and dare I say, non-existent reality for research relevant to Black survivors of homicide victims. And what I found were a series of gaps. Research on homicide focused primarily on the victim and the perpetrator. Research on African, Caribbean, and Black survivors of homicide victims was limited, relevant to their experience, both the individual impact and the community impact. Coping strategies were not examined, nor did they appear in the scholarship and manuscripts and research. We didn't have information relevant to the impact of experiencing the homicide of a loved one on the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of individuals. And we didn't understand the service utilization patterns. Where were people going for support? And also, we didn't have a true sense of programming that may respond to the unmet needs of Black survivors of homicide victims in a culturally responsive manner. Nor did we have tools of measurement designed with that framework in mind to be able to better understand how individuals cope. And so I began. I began by asking the research questions. What is the post-homicide experience of African-American survivors of homicide victims? I'm saying that now because that's where I started my work in the US. What supports do African-American survivors of homicide victims utilize? What are the grief responses to experiencing the homicide of a loved one? And how do African-Americans, survivors of homicide victims, cope? And so what became clear through a examination, if you will, an exploration of experiences with African-American survivors of homicide victims, having a series of interviews with them, was that the experience really involved both a social and cultural context in which individuals experienced the impact, but also identified coping strategies. So in-depth interviews really allowed for me to hear what African-American survivors of homicide victims were saying about the influence of who they are, the obstacles that they face, and the impact of those experiences on coping with the homicide of a loved one. And through this process, I was able to better understand both the social and cultural context that influenced the manner in which African-American survivors of homicide victims experience the homicide of a loved one and identify resources to cope with it. Let me show you. So the first portion is cultural trauma. Alexander and Ho refer to cultural trauma and describe it as the experience of being oppressed and marginalized and disenfranchised based upon one's racial and/or ethnic status. So the following themes identified by African-American survivors of homicide victims fall under that domain of cultural trauma. The first being ancestral survivorship. I just have confidence in African Americans' ability to be a people and understand from whence we came and understand how much baggage we've been able to destroy or clean up or whatever it is that we have had to deal with that I don't think we were born to bear. I believe the ability of my people to overcome so much, so many things, and still have not truly, in my opinion, arrived at first-class recognition by many, many people. We are still, I think, some of the greatest achievers there are. This is Margaret, a surviving grandparent. Under the same domain of cultural trauma was anticipated hardship. I'm trying to make sure that you understand that one of the reasons for me, and I dare say the majority of African Americans and people of color, the reason we keep things to ourselves is life is supposed to have a little bit of pain. You know, no sunshine without the rain. We grew up with those kind of anecdotes that make us hold things in. Everyone, I want you to keep your eye on Elaine, and we'll have a discussion about her as we round out this portion of the talk. But I want you to keep your eyes peeled to Elaine. And so what survivors were saying is that they, due to anti-Black racism, there's a domain that they experience. They experience cultural trauma as a result of the fact that we live in a racist society. So they experience racism, which is a form of trauma, before we even get to homicide. And then a homicide occurs. And what survivors shared with me is something that I deem and identified and named culture of homicide, where shame and stigma fall underneath that. I try to cope now by not being ashamed to talk about it, because I was ashamed to talk about it, especially being African American and the stereotypes of African Americans that we are just prone to this. And, you know, like, not every time I tell people this, not every time, I'm exaggerating now a bit here, but someone says, you know, oh, is it drug related? Like that is the first thing that pops out of their mouths over and over and over again with my interviews with survivors, both in the US and here. This idea of shame and stigma and stereotyping comes up. This is Malik, a surviving cousin. Under the domain of culture of trauma, culture of homicide, blame, I question whether or not there was something I could have done to keep him out of that environment, and therefore perhaps this never would have occurred. So I guess I'm saying in some sense, I'm always questioning whether or not I'm partially or a bit somehow responsible for his tragic death. This is Elaine, who was talking about her nephew who was murdered, and she was reflecting upon the fact that every summer he used to come and visit her. And the one summer he didn't is when he was murdered. And so she was blaming herself from her inability to protect him from harm. Again, this is a common theme that has come up in my interviews with survivors, both in the US and here in Canada. Again, under the culture of homicide, a lack of justice. I remember my brother was like, we all know who did it. And the problem is the police aren't doing anything about it. My brother was like, I know who it is, you know, we all know who it is, because my cousin was apparently not the right target. It is unsolved, and we just feel like they, meaning the police, don't care. This is Malik, a surviving cousin. Again, another common theme that keeps coming up in the survivors I've interviewed in the US and here in Canada. So how do we make sense of this? It appeared as though there was some interaction going on between culture of trauma and culture of homicide. And the work of Lazarus and Folkman helped to explain some of what was happening here. They have done a tremendous amount of work relevant to stress and coping. And what was clear to me that a stressor, homicide, was occurring, and survivors were appraising the stressor to determine what coping strategies should be utilized to manage the stressor, which is, again, something that Lazarus and Folkman talk about all the time. But for African-American survivors of homicide victims, it didn't appear to be that simple. There was something else going on. And my colleague and good friend came up with the term racial appraisal. And racial appraisal really talks about the fact that Lazarus and Folkman say that, okay, there's a stressor that happens, and now I'm going to appraise the impact of that to be able to assess what coping strategies I'm going to utilize. But for Black survivors of homicide victims, there seemed to be something different. But racial appraisal really says for Black people, disenfranchised populations, racial appraisal consists of both culture and structure. Culture is a set of shared attitudes and beliefs about the way things should be done, and it is crucial to how people perceive and cope with trauma. Structure shapes those perceptions in that it dictates the distribution of resources. Race is a component of our social structure that allocates material goods and services, social and psychological resources unevenly for racialized populations. Racialized populations like African Americans appraise stressful encounters and assess coping resources based upon this paradigm. So, in other words, African American survivors of homicide victims were appraising a coping strategy and identifying it, right? To be able, through a racialized lens, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So as a result of that, there are specific coping strategies that they identified. Spiritual coping. My grandmother used to say, if you have a problem, take it to God. She didn't say take it to the therapist. This is Elaine, surviving aunt. Meaning making. I believe in God, but to a certain extent, because I don't think God takes an innocent baby or a person that good that wants to help the world. So I keep telling myself he probably needs another angel now. This is Langston, an 18-year-old surviving cousin. Maintaining a connection to the deceased. I try to cope with it by maintaining a personal connection with him, meaning like having conversations with him sometimes when things get difficult, or remembering that I don't want anybody else to have to deal with the kind of thing that I did. So I almost talking to him or praying to him to get through not only the grief that I feel regarding his loss, but also to get through and do the work that I need to do. This is Trinity, a surviving cousin who just happened to be a social worker who was talking about her experience as a survivor, but saying that I really have to figure this out, right? So that I can be able to talk and assist other individuals that I know have experienced the same tragedy that she had. Collective coping and caring. I really focused on what my family was going through rather than what I was going through. I was really like, what do you need? How do we get this together? So in many ways, that was my coping mechanism by not dealing with it in many respects. So I focused my energies on helping other people. Now, this is Malik, the surviving cousin. And it's well documented in African-American family literature, Nancy Boyd Franklin, Elaine Pinder Hughes, who talk about the fact that collectivistic cultures, if you will, always rely on collective coping and caring during any times of stress. But what I've been able to unpack specific for Black survivors of homicide victims is that they're doing the collective is typically when you talk to a survivor and their family members, it's typically one or two individuals within that family unit that are caring for others, right? So it's not a collective sort of gathering of everyone coming to support one another. It's typically one or two people paying for the funeral, paying for Auntie so-and-so to fly in to attend the funeral, paying for bills after the fact, particularly if it's the primary caregiver that was murdered. The question becomes, how are those individuals coping? So it's an interesting thing to begin to parcel out. Concealment. I think I tend to internalize and find a small part of my heart or a small part of my mind, an actual small closet in my heart or a small closet in my mind to shut up those things that bother me. I don't know if you remember the movie The Godfather. There's a line in The Godfather where Michael says to his younger brother, you never speak against family. You never disagree with the family. You never go outside of the family. And I think that is just kind of my mantra. I'm just not of the belief that you go outside of the home to garner assistance with family or personal problems. Now, I said to you, keep your eyes on Elaine. Interestingly enough, Elaine was diagnosed with high blood pressure, diabetes, and smoked a pack and a half of cigarettes a day. What became clear to me when we talk about the idea or the notion of concealment, if you have shame and stigma, you don't want to be further stereotyped and stigmatized, so you're going to hold it in, which again is not uncommon to many Black survivors of homicide victims that I talk to. It has an impact on your health. And yet, when we go to the research and literature, There's very little scholarship regarding this correlation. So what became clear was a model of coping, if you will, by listening to the voices of African-American survivors and homicide victims. A model of coping emerged, wherein they were telling me that when they wake up, just because they are Black and we live in a racist society, that they experience racism, they experience a culture of trauma, right? That impacts them. Then they experience a homicide at least 2 times in their lifetime. And that the culture of trauma and the culture of homicide, where shame, blame, stigma, lack of justice are most paramount, we're working together with racial appraisal, right? The ability to appraise that stressor of homicide, that stressor of cultural trauma that are culminating, to identify coping strategies, all right? So what are the implications? With this understanding, there are a few thoughts that I had regarding research, policy, and practice. What this signals to us is that we have to do a better job in terms of having research that is conducted for and with the community. Participatory action research. Community has to be involved, shaping the questions, collecting the data, helping to analyze the data, and publishing and sharing the results, right? Because we have to better understand and have the questions driven by people that have experienced such atrocity, not once, but over and over again. We have to do a better job of creating tools of measurement that capture these trauma histories that individuals experience. There are windows of opportunity that are missed when we think about, I remember back in the day, the domestic violence, intimate partner violence initiatives were capturing trauma histories with doctors and training doctors and pediatricians to be able to assess trauma histories when parents would bring their children in for wellness checks. We can be creative about doing this, but also that we have to think about the interplay between the experiences of racism and homicide in the tools of measurement. We've got to begin to explore the experiences of Black survivors of homicide victims throughout the diaspora. Black people are not a monolith. And so we have to be able to begin to understand, and we're doing some of that work now, what are those nuances and factors that impacted the ability to cope with such tragedy. We have to expand scholarship and post-homicide research by engaging and training emerging scholars to be able to partner with community members to be able to do this work. And we have to be able to begin to share the results and make them available to community. Implications for policy: collecting homicide data by race. Many of you will note, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, that that we've been able to respond to this unmet need in a very creative way. So I'll save that for a little bit later. And again, we need to make policy to be able to capture the trauma histories of individuals, families, and communities to better be positioned to know how to serve them and what is the experience of exposure to chronic cumulative Black death. Building community capacity to advocate for policy change. Some of the creative projects that we've been a part of have really, again, centered the voices of survivors and service providers to be able to understand what are the recommendations for policy, but then take it a step further in terms of having to training for community agencies to best understand how to advocate for those policy changes so that they're cemented into law. Practice: programming and interventions must be culturally aware and responsive. We have to think about historical experiences with trauma. We have to consider racism, anti-Black racism, as trauma. And so we have to begin able to capture the historical experiences of communities and individuals to be able to better understand how and when we can intervene. We have to be able to train clinical and service providers, faith-based community, legal counsel, physicians, police on how are you going to be more culturally responsive in your practice? What are you going to say to the next survivor of homicide who comes to your door? Many times the calls that I get and the requests that I get are asking us to train individuals to be able to better position themselves to be able to respond to Black survivors and homicide victims in a culturally responsive manner, create sustainable opportunities for communities to not just survive the trauma, but thrive it. What does that look like when we think about the root causes and consequences of homicide? So with this understanding, I was clear that with the absence of acknowledging chronic and cumulative Black death, it obstructs our ability to comprehend and respond appropriately to the traumatic impact homicide has on family members and friends of homicide victims. Moreover, neglecting to acknowledge the chronic overrepresentation of Black homicide victims is yet another form of victimization. Truly valuing Black lives requires engagement and thorough assessment and candid conversations about the root causes and consequences of homicide for Black communities. It's been a little over 22 years since I met Edna. And I've come to realize that the solutions, if you will, really lies in thinking beyond having just a seat at the table. It lies within creating a table where we all can eat. Creating a table where Black voices are not a part of the conversation, but they are central to it. And it's with this understanding and that growth, that fundamental paradigm shift in my thinking, that the CRIB was established. The Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors and Homicide Victims was established so that we can respond to those formative rifts through the advancement of culturally responsive research, policy, and practice designed to meet the unmet needs of Black survivors of homicide victims. Our vision is to develop culturally responsive approaches for Black survivors of homicide victims throughout our global communities. Our mission is to reduce service inequities for and with Black survivors of homicide victims through the advancement of collaborative, culturally responsive research and impactful policy and practice. Our values are rooted in equity from the community, with the community, embrace, drive, and change, create sustainable opportunities for communities, cultural humility, passion and determination, and adopting culturally responsive approaches in everything that we do. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my amazing, amazing, amazing CRIB team, and also acknowledge the hard work of our faculty affiliates, our tri-campus of faculty affiliates here at U of T, but also at several universities in the US, who see themselves in the work. Whether they're in public health, education, engineering, sociology, they see themselves in the work. Our current funding, we are funded by the University of Toronto's Provost Office in the Division of University Advancement. We've received a Sharp Insight grant. We've also received funding from the Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate, the US Department of Justice, Baltimore City Health Department, Office of Youth Violence Prevention Programming, and the University of Maryland School of Social Work. And so with our current funding, we've been able to create some really intriguing work, very successful work. The first most I want to share with you is one of our most recent projects, where in the absence of race-based data that speaks to the amount of homicide victims, we were able to develop what we call a homicide tracker. It's a GIS mapping interactive map where you're able to look at from 2004 to, I believe, 2020, the number of homicides that have occurred in Toronto, and look at what the frequency of homicides have been in those neighborhoods, as well as be able to identify those supports and services that exist or don't in those same neighborhoods where homicide is frequently occurring. We also overlaid that with Toronto Police Service data and census data, and we were able to garner or assess where we believe the majority of African, Caribbean, and Black neighborhoods are. And so when you view this map, you're really able to see the disproportionate reality of homicide for Black communities. In addition, we posted and developed the social determinants of what I deem the social determinants of homicide, where we begin to look at the root causes, those structural inequities, inequitable access to educational opportunities, housing opportunities, employment opportunities, low wages, as contributing factors to the frequency and disproportionate reality of homicide for Black communities. We intend to continue to report on these inequities moving forward. The Invisible Wounds Project, which was the first project of its kind funded by the Sharpe Insight Grant, where we were able to conduct focus groups with African, Caribbean, Black survivors of homicide victims throughout the GTA, for the purpose, again, of developing a model that speaks to their experiences, as well as a digital storytelling component, wherein they're able to amplify what is the impact and what do they see as a pathway forward. The Survivors of Homicide Victims and Mental Health Project, in partnership with the Canadian Mental Health Association, again, the first project of its kind, where we were funded by the Anti-Racism Directorate of Ontario, where we were able to conduct focus groups with Indigenous, African, Caribbean, and Black, and racialized survivors of homicide victims and their service providers to better understand what's hurtful and helpful to helping address the service needs of survivors of homicide victims. Out of that process came 10 policy recommendations from service providers about what we should be doing and how we should go about amplifying and changing the game, the playing field, if you will, to better meet the needs of survivors of homicide victims from those communities. The Inventory of Stress and Coping for African American Survivors of Homicide Victims is a tool of measurement that I developed from that model of coping that I showed with you to begin to give tools to service providers and practitioners to better help them be able to assess how individuals are going about identifying coping strategies and what coping strategies they are utilizing to be able to include those in the continuity of care. It's the intention, our intent, to be able to adapt that particular inventory to respond to the needs of African, Caribbean, and Black survivors of homicide victims here in Canada. 3830 Instagram live series, where every Wednesday night for 30 minutes, we simply hold the space for candid conversations with scholars throughout North America, as well as people on the ground, grassroots people on the ground doing the work to really be able to talk about the structural inequities that are inherently violent, that are disproportionately impacting some of our most vulnerable. And last but certainly not least, with my colleague at the Fordham University in New York, who developed the first police encounter survey. We were able to disseminate that survey to 4 cities throughout the US to understand what have been the encounters, what has been the experience of individuals encountering the police, and how has it impacted their mental health outcomes. Now, the crib will turn 3. So we're fairly young, strong but mighty. And we've done a lot of work thus far, but there's still so much more to do. We believe that education and training, developing a post-homicide training certificate to respond to the many requests that are coming through the door for service providers to be trained on how to be more culturally responsive in the delivery of services to Black survivors of homicide victims. We're working on providing that training as a result of the research that we conducted for the Survivors of Homicide Victims and Mental Health Project. We want to train an emerging scholars pipeline, train social workers, train educators, train individuals, create a pipeline of scholars to be able to give them the tools, working with community agencies and other interdisciplinary network of scholars, to be able to understand, how do I go about amplifying this work in my practice, in my research? We want to create more local community partnerships and engagement. We want to actually have a training. We've already trained a series of neighborhood ambassadors for the Invisible Wounds Project. But why not have that be a pathway of sustainable income and reciprocity, where neighborhood ambassadors are sharing so much of themselves, so much of their knowledge and expertise with us. And we can certainly share training and knowledge in terms of research protocols and ethics. And then we can actually have a sustainable programming where neighborhood ambassadors can always be employed in our research projects, doing some of the most amazing work. Policy and advocacy training, as I mentioned before, I don't want those 10 policy recommendations to sit on someone's shelf. Imagine what we could do. Those policy recommendations came from Indigenous, Black, and racialized survivors of homicide victims. We have a responsibility to take it a step further and make sure that those policies are actually implemented. And so through training and coalition building, we can begin to make that happen. Knowledge dissemination and outreach. Again, we envision ourselves having a global summit where we're bringing again together international scholars and grassroots community folk to be able to learn from one another, to expand our thinking and possibly create international partnerships, as well as a distinguished lecture series, always providing U of T with opportunities to educate and train the emerging scholars network with some of the individuals in the field that are doing the work. And of course, continuing to disseminate our findings through innovative pathways like the 30 Instagram Live series. So our pathway forward, what do we do with it all? Our pathway forward requires us to understand that our response to the pandemic of grief must be for Black survivors of homicide victims. It must be as vast as its impact. After every presentation, I'm often told, wow, that's a lot. I don't know where to begin. I don't know how to help. Or how can I even get involved? As social workers, we have a responsibility to act. And we have ways that you can help. You can certainly help by donating to the crib and supporting its culturally responsive research, education, policy work, community intervention work, and advocacy. Follow the crib for news and information, and then amplify that information by sharing it. Invite us to spaces where we can share this information with others. My dear colleagues, the impact of COVID has taught us many things. One of which is that we are inherently reliant upon one another for our survival. It is through that same framework that I ask you to consider the fact that we are stronger together than we are apart. Together, seated at a new table, we have the opportunity to maximize our greatest potential, to not simply help Black people survive the pandemic of grief as a result of homicide, but perhaps thrive thereafter it. I look forward to the possibilities their lives are depending on. Thank you.